Thank you very much, Knut. Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's monthly members lecture at the Oriental Institute. My name is Wally Verdoren. I'm the Director of Development here at the OI. I first want to express, as always, a special word of thanks to our many members whose annual support makes this lecture series and so much other programming possible here at the OI, and not only possible, but open and free to anyone who wants to join us, either here in Breasted Hall or now via live video stream on YouTube. Welcome to all those who are joining us in that way. If you aren't a member yet, consider becoming one. You can find information on OI membership and its many benefits on our website. Christopher Woods, the OI's director, who usually introduces our speakers, is actually out of the country, has been for the last few weeks on OI business. And fortunately, we have another esteemed OI scholar who will be making our formal speaker introductions this evening. And so I would like to call to the podium Dr. Theo Vandenhout, who is the Arthur and Joanne Rasmussen Professor of Hittite and Anatolian Languages, and the Executive Director of the Chicago Hittite Dictionary Project, and also a fellow Nederlander. So, Theo, would you like to come to the podium?
Thank you so much, Wally, for your very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's an honor for me to be able to fill in for our director, Professor Christopher Woods, and an even greater honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor McGuire Gibson, whom we all know as Mac, who will speak on the OI excavations in Iraq. OI, because as you know, we are celebrating our centennial, thought it would be a good idea, and it is indeed, to feature at our members' lectures this year our own faculty. And who better to start with than Professor Gibson? In cases such as these, you start with a CV if you have to introduce someone. So I wrote to Mac, can you send me your CV? And he did very kindly, but it came with a warning. He said, it's pretty long, you might prefer a much shorter prose-style bio. That is not how we do things here at the OI. So I delved into his full CV, and that's where I got the following information. So Mac got his PhD actually from this university in 1968. Then he went away for a while between 1968 and 1972. He worked at UIC and at the University of Arizona at Tucson as an assistant professor of anthropology, which was a surprise for me. And then in 1972, he returned to UChicago, where he then stayed for, well, he still is here, for more than 45 years, and he retired at the beginning of this year in 2019. And in those more than 45 years, Mac, if I may call you that here, devoted his career to the archaeology of Mesopotamia. And in that period, he sat on countless boards and committees within the university and outside. So, for example, he is or was the president and founder, and still is, trustee of the American Institute for Yemeni Studies. Between 1984 and 1988, he was the chair of the Council of American Overseas Research Centers and served 3 more years as the treasurer of that body. And these are just a few highlights that I picked out of there. And especially I noted from 1989 to 2014, he was the president of the American Association for Research in Baghdad, which during his tenure was renamed as the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq. And I can only imagine how that period, I mean, which was such a period of upheaval in the inner politics of Iraq, how hectic that must have been, and also how important. Mac spent, of course, most of his archaeological work in Iraq. He was the director of the Oriental Institute expedition to Nippur from 1972 onwards until 2018. But he also worked at other Iraqi sites and also in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Syria. Besides his archaeological work, he initiated and led countless projects. He organized exhibits. He was the recipient of many grants. And I want to mention here especially a very recent one. In 2016, he was the primary investigator, the PI, for a very prestigious project with our own University of Chicago Neubauer Collegium, where he received a grant for a project on long-term environmental and social change in Mesopotamia. And beside all those activities, he still found time to author or edit some 12 books and many, many articles. And his CV only gives a selection of those articles. But more importantly, maybe for tonight, is that I know Mac as a great and wonderful storyteller. I hope you have all seen the book that the OI published because of our centennial, entitled Discovering New Pasts, the OI at 100. It's for sale in the souk. And he contributed to that volume a chapter on the OI involvement in Mesopotamia, co-authored with Gene Evans, the director of our museum, as you know, and Karen Wilson. And just one story from there. I hope I'm not stealing that from your lecture. One story in there I just want to repeat to you because I think it's a wonderful story. It's about Seton Lloyd and Thorkild Jacobsen, who were on their way from one dig house to another, and now I quote, just as a sandstorm came in. They had gotten less than halfway as the curtain of sand and the coming dark made it difficult to see the track. So they decided to turn around and return, following their own tracks. But soon, in order to see their tracks, Jacobsen had to get out and walk in front of the car, using its lights to guide him. But finally, he told Lloyd that he couldn't see the track at all and was worried that they would become totally lost. He said they should just sleep in the car for the night and make it back the next morning. The next morning, as the sand had settled and all the dust, they woke up to find that they were parked no more than 10 feet away from the wall of the dig house that they were trying to reach. They had followed the tracks to where the car had been parked the day before. So I hope you will now join me in welcoming Professor McGuire Gibson.
A boy was once given a task to turn in a book report on some book that he had read. And he read Moby Dick. And his book report starts, "This book tells me far more than I want to know about Moby Dick." I'm going to be covering a lot of time and a lot of territory. And I hope that I'm not going to be telling you more about Nippur and such things than you need to know, but we'll try. Okay, we're in the Fertile Crescent, which was a term which was coined by Breasted, who's there in that photograph, in that painting. And we're in the eastern end of it. We're going to be talking about ancient Mesopotamia, and mostly we're going to be talking about the south, with a little bit going on in the north. It works. Okay. I'm going to be talking mostly about Nippur, but I'll also do a little bit on the dialysites, which are up there in the middle of the map, and also Khorsabad, where the Oriental Institute has worked. Nippur which is going to be mainly what I talk about, was the first Mesopotamian site dug by Americans. The University of Pennsylvania worked there from 1889 to 1900, and it was led initially by John Peters. He had looked at what was going on. The Germans were working, the French had been working in Mesopotamia for some years and were bringing back marvelous things to the Louvre. And so he sent out a letter to all the cuneiform scholars and other people interested in Mesopotamia at about 1888, and saying, you know, they're ahead of us, we should really do something, the Americans should get involved. And so they sent out a little expedition. It turned out that Peters then led the expedition beginning in 1889 for the University of Pennsylvania. I mean, they worked there for about 10 years. He got the permission from this guy named Hamdi Bey, who was the Ottoman Director of Antiquities. Hermann Hilprecht, who was a cuneiformist from the University of Pennsylvania, was on the dig that year. He and Peters became great enemies, and there was a major ruckus between them over the next 10 years or so. The actual digging at the site was done mainly by John Henry Haynes. And in the very first season, they made two tremendous mistakes. One, they decided to pitch their camp at the very top of the mound. This mound of Nippur is about almost a mile long, and it's about 60 to 80 feet high in places. And they pitched their tents and their reed houses up on the top of that mound, and they just caught all the worst wind you can imagine through the winter that they were there, and they almost froze to death. They also dug a lot of ragged holes and tunnels across the site, but they found lots and lots of things. The second season, they set up a camp down on the flat where they were out of the wind. And then finally, they built a house, which was surrounded by a little camp of people who worked for them, the local Arabs. And that house was still standing up to the second floor, although the roofs had been taken off, when the University of Chicago sent out a group led by Breasted to look at sites all across the Middle East and decide where they were going to dig. And they went and looked at Nippur. They didn't think much of it, and so they didn't know what they were going to dig, but they took a look at a lot of sites. The Nippur ziggurat has on top of it a building that people think is a temple, but in fact it's a house that was built with ancient bricks, ancient baked bricks, by Mr. Haynes, because he didn't want to have to walk all the way back to the house, and he was getting more and more worried about what was going on. He was there for a whole year once, the only non-Arab, the only non-Turk on the site, and he was going slightly strange. Mr. Haynes, as a matter of fact, ended up his life in an insane asylum in New Jersey. Nippur can do that to you. Now, as I said, the site is enormous, and this is a plaster cast that used to be in the Penn Museum, showing the various sorts of trenches and holes that they made at the site. And it represents only the major things they did, because they in fact put trenches and tunnels all over the site. The four arrows are pointing to the main places they worked on. The little one, the shorter of those four lines, is what they call Tablet Hill, because they found lots and lots of tablets. As a matter of fact, the other line that goes down to the south there, goes over to the other mound, that's got just as many tablets coming out of it, and that's an even deeper hole, huge holes. The expedition did work with about 400 workmen, and they moved a lot of dirt. It's sort of Cecil B. DeMille in aspect. And a lot of what they've done, a lot of what they've left in this picture makes no sense whatever. That stairway is not a real stairway. It's a stairway you cut in the dirt in order to be able to go up and down. That wriggly thing that goes out to the right of that, it's a drain from a particular period, and they thought it was so nice they just left it in place, and they just left it with the dirt under it, but it makes no sense whatever. They weren't very good at what they were doing. They didn't have the skill to do this. Haynes was assisted one season by a man named Clarence Fisher, who's a better archaeologist and in fact a fairly good architect. And he later dug for the Oriental Institute at Megiddo in what was then Palestine. This gives you an idea of what they did. The ziggurat actually stops. Oh, I'm on the wrong thing. There we go. That is the stairway leading up to the top of the ziggurat, and it actually stops about halfway, right there where the arrow is. That's the bottom of the ziggurat. All of that is earlier material. And most of what is up here, what do we do? Did that do it? Yeah. What's up here, a lot of that is part of a huge Parthian fortress, Parthian being roughly Roman period. And so what happens is in the Parthian period, they come and they use the ziggurat as the center of a big fortification. Now, Penn found a lot of stuff, but it's not very clear in many cases where it came from. Their main contribution is about 40,000 cuneiform tablets, which are extremely important, for instance, because there are a lot of bilingual Sumerian and Akkadian texts, which helps to decipher Sumerian. It also has, at that time, was the main source we had of certain dynasties, for instance, the Kassite dynasty, which is better known here than any place else, and just material from all periods, because since it was a religious site, kings would come there to be recognized as kings, and they would leave lots and lots of gifts, leaving their name and saying when they had done it and why they had done it. Now, Penn stopped digging there at about 1900. At about that time, John D. Rockefeller gave a lot of money and founded the University of Chicago. He recruited William Rainey Harper, who was 35 years old at the time, to become the first president of the university. If you look at some of the old White City, the World's exhibition, the Columbian exhibition of that period, you see in the background they're building the University of Chicago sort of out near the Midway, out beyond the Midway. And they were building the university at that time. And immediately he hired on his brother, Robert Francis Harper, who to do cuneiform, and he hired James Henry Breasted to do Egyptology. They founded a museum called the Haskell Oriental Museum. If you go there today, you can see on the side it says Lux Ex Oriente, a light from the east, and they had a collection of artifacts. In 1903, 1905, they sponsored a dig at a place called Adab, or modern Bismaya, in southern Iraq, and they hired this man, Edgar James Banks, to do the digging. You'll notice that he's all dressed up in Arab garb. You're going to see a lot of clothing changes going on in these pictures. If you go through the museum here, you will see several things from this dig, including the head of the king. Actually, I think the head of the king may be on loan someplace. But he left a dig house there built out of ancient baked bricks. Now, 1919, Breasted founds the Oriental Institute with a gift from John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The way that happened was that Mrs. Rockefeller used to read Breasted's books to her sons, and she became very, very fond of Breasted. They asked Breasted at one point to take them on a tour of Egypt. They went up the Nile, they came down the Nile, and it ended up with his giving a gift to found the Institute. Breasted was a great genius, and he was a man of great vision. He took a group, right after the war stopped in the First World War, he took a group to the Near East to look not only at sites in Egypt, but all across the Middle East, including Nippur. After a few years, in the 20s, they had teams working in Egypt, well, before that even, at the Chicago House. They worked in Turkey at Alishar, in Syria, the Yarmouk Valley, around Antioch, in Palestine at Megiddo, in Iran, Persepolis and the area around it, and Iraq at two sites, Khorsabad in the Assyrian area, and the Diyala region, which is just to the east of Baghdad. Everywhere they built dig houses to signal that it was a long-term commitment, but little was known in detail about the archaeology in any of these places. They had almost no notion really of what the pottery looked like, what the artwork looked like, how it changed through time, what was significant for what period. That was the state of the field at the time. One of the main research aims laid out was to establish the chronology and the history of each of these areas, digging stratigraphically, meaning coming down, realizing that what's down here is earlier than what's up here, and combining this data from archaeology with art style changes and the written documents, along with the available science at the time. By the way, the idea of stratigraphy, things being up, the oldest stuff being down. We were down in a deep hole once at Nippur, and working away, and we heard these voices. We look up, and they're tourists, English tourists, around the edge of the hole. And one moment, they asked us several questions. One woman said, "Why did they live underground?" And I explained to them that, this site was basically built with mud brick, adobe, unbaked brick, that when your house gets old enough and starting to have problems, you take the roof off, you because you're going to reuse the timbers of the roof, you knock the walls down inside themselves, and you build on top of that, and you build on top of that. And after a little bit of time, you get a mound. And if you stay in one place long enough, you get a very big mound. Right. Anyway, at that time, in the 30s, with all this money in the 20s and 30s, with all this money available, and especially when the Depression hit, and the Institute had money and very few other places did, Breasted was able to buy the finest archaeologists, the finest architects, art historians, and ancient language scholars to stock that institute. And with many of these field crews, the architects especially, and some of the others, they would go from place to place. They'd go from Syria, and then they would go to Iraq, and then they'd go to Turkey, and they'd go, bouncing around, go to Iran as they were needed. They were professional diggers at that point. Now, one of the first place that we dug in Iraq was Khorsabad, ancient Dur-Shurokeen, which was excavated under Gordon Loud. Henry Frankfurt was also there for a while, but basically it was done by Loud. And they found phenomenal stuff, like a wall painting which had fallen down, and they were able to reconstruct what it looked like. And that's the scale, and that's pretty much what it looked like. Also, they were in this site which had been dug already in about 1840s by the French. And so in many cases, what they were doing is redigging what the French had dug, and they took, this is our Chicago bull, and the hero with the lion, and that's the parade of people that you see in our hall. Now, one of the amazing things was they took the stuff into the dig house in pieces, because the bull, for instance, was in pieces. When they got it together inside, or they put it in crates, it was too big to come out again through the door. So they had to take it over the roof. They hired a guy named Pinhas de Lugas, who was an engineer trained in France, to do this job. And if you look in the hall, you'll see the story of how they got these huge pieces of stuff to this river, and how they were put on a boat, which was really not equipped to take them, and they got them home to Chicago. And then they reconstructed them inside the building. Now, Frankfurt was a very, very great scholar, another genius. He'd been working at Amarna in Egypt, and Breasted visited, was very much impressed with him, and hired him. And Frankfurt said, yes, I'll do it, but you should also hire this guy, this architect, this Englishman named Seton Lloyd. And that was a very, very fine hire. Anyway, he went out to Iraq to look for sites in antiquities dealers' offices. In those days, you could buy and sell antiquities in Iraq. He was seeing statues, and he was seeing other kinds of things, art history, things which are art historical, that really fascinated him. He wanted, because he was essentially an art historian. And this would allow the writing of the history of art in early Mesopotamia. So he found out that these statues were coming from a place called the Diyala region, 4 sites in the Diyala region. He chose Tel Asmar, Tel Ajrab, Khafaji, and Ischali. And it was, by the way, going back from Ischali to Asmar. On the weekends, the people who were at the different sites would get in their cars and go back to Tel Asmar for the weekend, and would spend the Thursday night, Friday, and probably part of Saturday, and then go back to the other sites. That's the story with Jacobson and Seton Lloyd in the sandstone. Tel Asmar is a very, very large site, and it was being very badly dug by local people, and so they began to dig, and they were finding fantastic things. They dug a whole group of temples and palaces and houses at the site. They lived in a rather elaborate dig house, which they built, and in those days you could build that for, say, something like $4,000. And by the way, I built a 20-room house in Syria a few years ago, and it cost us $20,000, which wasn't bad. Okay, and they live fairly well. It looks posh compared to some dig houses, but it's very comfortable. If you're going to be out there 9 months a year, which they were, you want to be comfortable. All right, these are the main characters on the dig. De Lugas, wearing a pith helmet. Jacobson, wearing shorts. but a tie. Notice he's got a tie on. Breasted is visiting, so of course he's going to have a tie. Frankfurt has a tie. And the entire dig crew is brilliantly laid. I'm sorry this is not as good a image of that. This is a brilliant piece of work. This was done by Rachel Levy, the woman on the left. She was the artist for the dig. She composed this. There's a much better photograph, there's a much better picture of this in that Centennial book, which is on sale outside. All right, the Mary Chubb was the woman who did the records in the catalog. Seton Lloyd, that's a brilliant, if you knew these people, it's a brilliant depiction of Seton Lloyd. He was a tall, thin guy, and he looks just like that. The next guy is the Baron zu Elst, I know not much about. Reimer Jacobsen, who was married, she was a photographer, she was married to Torkel Jacobsen. There's Henry Frankfurt and his wife Henrietta. They had two Salukis, one called Yasmin, and I've forgotten the name of the other one. The next one was Harold Hill, one of the architects. Then you get Jacobsen, he is drinking beer out of a jar with a long straw, and again, it has captured him beautifully. Jacobsen was here in the Institute for years and years. Then you have Ham Darby, another one of the architects, and finally you have DeLugas sitting at the end. And again, she's depicted DeLugas brilliantly. Okay, that was Tel Asmar. They also dug at Kafaji, and Kafaji is famous for this big temple oval. And that was a fantastic bit of digging. Essentially, DeLugas dug this and reports on it. You can see the little dig house in the background, nowhere near as big as the one at Tel Asmar, but it's sufficient. Now, what they did with these digs, at these two sites plus Tel Ajrab and Nishchali, is they were able to, it was improved digging techniques, better than most people. They really learned how to work with mud brick, it can be difficult. And by digging stratigraphically, by saying this is here, this is here, this is here, and we know this is earlier than that, they were able to lay out a big part of the stratigraphy from about 3200 to about 2000 BC based on the stratigraphy. Now, they didn't get it completely right all the time, but they got, the basic thing is right. And they were able to lay in the artifacts that relate to one another. Very, very important. Frankfurt, the art historian, arranged cylinder seals by chronology, by stratigraphy and chronology. And if you go to look at their halls, you will see we've laid it out, and we're basically following what Frankfurt has done. And it was a brilliant piece of work what he did. He also worked on the statues, and you will see some of these statues in this building. He worked on the Sumerian statues and wrote two books about it. And the thing with the Diyala is they set out to write about 11 books all told, and they got about 7 of them done, and 1 or 2 more are in process. Okay, Torkel Jacobsen. He's a very important guy. Expert cuneiform scholar, very good archaeologist, and the first person to do regional survey. In the Diyala region, as early as 1933, he realized that if you, although you couldn't see the ancient canals because they're buried by siltation, later silt, even though they don't show on the surface, if you visit the sites in an area and pick up the pottery and date the pottery, you would know the periods when a site was occupied. So it's say it's at 3000, 2000, 1000, you have settlement there. Then if you draw lines between the sites, like drawing lines between dots, you can reconstruct the canal system through time. And that was a brilliant thing he did. Very shortly after that, by the way, Braidwood in Syria did his own survey and published a very important survey book on it, about a year later. Okay, now what's very important is by 1936, even the Institute ran out of money. And so they had to stop work in Iraq. Frankfurt came back to Chicago and he taught a famous seminar in which students compiled the first good artifact sequences for Iran, Iraq, and Western Syria. At about the same time, 1937 or so, Iraq sent 2 students, Fuad Safar and Taha Bakr, who got MA degrees, didn't finish the PhDs because they had to leave when the Second World War started. These people, Taha Bakr, especially at the University of Baghdad, and Fuad Safar in the Department of Antiquities, became the key people making that work, setting up the study of ancient Mesopotamia in Iraq. Muhammad Ali Mustafa was an engineer. He worked with them. He was also very important. He didn't get a chance to come out for a degree. But this is Chicago's effect in another way. Now, because what happened during the war, although foreigners couldn't go work in Iraq because the war was on, Seton Lloyd stayed there, as an advisor to the Department of Antiquities. And he, working with Fuad Safar and Muhammad Ali Mustafa, and sometimes with Taha Bakr, filled in the prehistoric sequence in Iraq, which was not covered by the Diyala, and they did other very important digs in the historic period during the war. So they really, theirs was an incredible contribution during the war. After the war, 1948, the OI returned to Iraq. Braidwood began his groundbreaking interdisciplinary work on early agriculture and domestication of animals in 1948 in the north, Jarmo and the area around it. And by doing that, he set off an incredible explosion of investigations of this agriculture and domestication all around the world. He's extraordinarily important. Working with him as a student was Robert McCormick Adams. Adams later, beginning in 1957, going into 1975, did surveys in which he mapped over 4,000 sites in southern Iraq. Later on, he became OI director and was secretary of the Smithsonian. And this gives you an idea of what he was dealing with. This is part of Adams's survey showing some of the thousands of sites and many ancient canals and river courses he mapped in southern Iraq from 57 to 75. By the way, up there in the middle of that, there's a little site in red, UMH. That's al-Hafriyat. We might get a chance to talk about that later if we don't run out of time. And there is Adab, where the University of Chicago worked in 1903, 1905. So you see where it is in relation to Nippur. Students followed Adams's lead. I did a survey around Kish. Henry Wright did a survey around Ur and Eridu down in the south. But a major new talent arose when Tony Wilkinson began to work in Iraq in the 1980s. Using remote sensing, satellite imagery, he was able to do total landscape study. The Oriental Institute hired him in 1992, and it is one of the best hires the Institute ever made. He did numerous projects across the Middle East. He founded the Camel Lab upstairs and trained many students for 10 years here, and then went off to Edinburgh. Unfortunately, he died too early, and we lost him. Anyway, these are the two areas in Iraq where he did surveys, intensive walking, getting out and actually walking over the landscape, really understanding the landscape, and founding landscape archaeology in a very big way. And he trained the students. For instance, all these dots, all these red dots, these are sites which can be seen on satellite imagery. And this map was put together by Carrie Ritz, one of our students here, who was trained by Wilkinson. She got her PhD with me. And she put 4,000 sites on the map. She later put more than another 3,000 sites on. And there were other students who were working and put sites on the map up in Assyria. That rectangle you see it shows no sites because we don't have the information, but this was done by Abdul Amir Hamdani, who is a student of one of our students at Stony Brook, and he put 1,200 newly located sites in and around what had been former marshes, so that we go into other generations. Our students are teaching their students who are now getting out and teaching other students in universities all across the world at this point. Okay, the Oriental Institute also began digging at Nippur in 1948. Notice there are no ties here. No one's wearing a tie. Oh, no, that's not true. The guy on the right, who is Muhammad Ali Mustafa, is wearing a tie. Okay, nobody else is wearing a tie. Everybody else is more casual. Nobody's wearing jodhpurs. Nobody's wearing shorts. But what you see is Carl Haynes on the left. He was the architect. McCown was the director. Haynes has his wife, who is the woman on the sitting next to the child. That's her son. That's her daughter. They began to take their children out to the area when they were 3 and 4 years old. They ran around the village with all the local kids. They went to the schools. They had a wonderful time, and nobody died or nobody got even seriously sick. And that's John Wilson, who was director at the time in the 50s, the third person in from the right on the back, and that's his wife sitting on the right in the front. Now, they began digging there because Thorkild Jakobsen was a Sumerologist, and he wanted more Sumerian literary tablets like Penn had gotten. So they went to work once again at Nippur, and they found lots of tablets. But they were doing stratigraphic digging to expand the artifact chronology being done in the Diyala, and the methods were better, and the recording was better than it had been back in the 30s, and the 30s was better than it had been earlier than that. than that. Here you have a picture slightly later with Fuad Safar, who is coming down. He was the representative from the government on the dig that year. There's Jacobson. He's the epigrapher, the person who reads the tablets. Haynes is by now the director, and the guy in Asil was the director of antiquities. This is a nice photograph. I like this one. These are the Shagadi workmen. These are the guys who did the actual skilled picking, and these people could be geniuses. Their fathers had worked with the British and the French and the Germans earlier. Their grandfathers had worked with the Germans at Babylon and the Germans at Uruk and the Germans in Ashur. And so it became something that these people in these villages up around Ashur did. And they would go all around the country and would work for dig after dig after dig. Now, 1948, this is what the site looked like. You can hardly see there is a site. I mean, you can see that there is there's Tablet Hill right there, and there's the ziggurat area, and over here is the West Mound, and this whole area of the West Mound, you can't really see it. It's covered with dunes. Between 1920 and 1948, this site is completely inundated by a dune belt. The dune belt stretches for another 200 or 300 miles northeast, and it goes out to the east about another 30 or 40 miles, and it goes south another 30 or 40 miles. It's a gigantic dune belt. Now, they began to dig in Tablet Hill, trenches TA and TB, and they laid out a sequence of pottery which stayed pretty much standard for about 50 years, and it supplements what was done in the Diyala because it goes later. But there's that curious thing here. This line like that. See, pottery changes slowly through time, and you can go into another period, but the pottery continues. It comes into being, it gets populated, it goes out of fashion. Something else picks it up, and so you're looking at time going on, and you're looking at changes in pottery style. What goes on here? There's something funny here. Now, when I was a student here in the first classes I took. I went around the corner to where Donald Hanson was working. Donald Hanson was an archaeologist who was working for the Nippur project, and he prepared this chart. I said, Don, what's going on here? This is something funny here. He said, Mac, frankly, I think they lost some pottery bags. They also lost some bags of pottery, because he couldn't explain it any other way. Okay, but anyway, this pretended to be a pottery sequence unbroken from about at least 2400 to about 300 BC. And after they finished digging at Tablet Hill, they began to work on what became known as the Inanna temple. Inanna is the goddess of love and war. She becomes Ishtar in later times, and she's a very important lady. And they dug an enormous hole, and they went down layer by layer by layer. They got 19 levels, and there's temple built on top of temple, built on top of temple, built on top of temple. Working with Haynes at this point is Donald P. Hanson, who is a great archaeologist and a great excavator, and James Knudstad, who's an architect, also an excellent excavator. And because they learned themselves to do the digging, and they learned to do it very well, you don't depend as much on the Iraqi diggers. You can check their work. And they finished the Inanna Temple in 1962, and what they had found was this. Now, this is not temple beside temple. This is temple on top of temple on top of temple, getting more elaborate as it comes along. Notice that there are two sanctuaries, the pieces in red, two sanctuaries in this building. One is a standard sort of a temple sanctuary. The one over here, that's a standard one with the altar up here. You come in from the side and you face the altar. This one is a funny thing, which is a little forecourt and then a thing inside. And I suspect that one on the left is a place where Enlil, the chief god at Nippur, Enlil is supposed to have struck a pick into the ground, and the first human comes out. And he does this in Inanna's temple, and I suspect this is what it does. Now, they found fantastic things in the Inanna temple, and this museum has some of them. It doesn't have this piece. This stayed in Baghdad. This piece of calcite with a gold face is a spectacular piece. But there are other statues which you will find in the museum hall. They also found foundation statues. There was something in 6 or 7 places there are foundation deposits in which you get these statues. When they were digging this, and when they were digging earlier around the ziggurat, they had looked for foundation deposits at the ziggurat and hadn't found anything. They dug down and they couldn't find the foundation boxes. They knew they were there, but they didn't find them. When they began to, these were from the Ur III version of the temple. When they decided they were going to go below that temple, they demolished it and they started going down. As they demolished it, they were finding the foundation boxes with a statue in each box. There were about 6 of them. And at that point, they figured out why they had been missing the statues elsewhere, because they weren't exactly where they thought they would be. They thought I have to go to the next slide. They thought they would be sort of right there in the middle. But in fact, they were a little bit off to the side. They weren't exactly in the middle. They were off to the side. So once they saw that, they found the first couple. And Karl Haynes turned to his chief pickman and said, "Shall we?" And the Shagadi said, "Let's." So they took a couple of pickmen. They went over to in front of the ziggurat where they had looked in a doorway for the foundation deposits a couple of years earlier. They dug off to the side and they came up with 2 foundation deposits. We have one in the museum, statue of Ur-Nammu. Now, the statues that you see there, those are of Shulgi, who is the son of Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu was the founder of the Ur III dynasty around 2100. Ur-Nammu builds the ziggurat, and Shulgi builds the Inanna temple. Now, notice that in the Inanna temple here, this one, this whole back part is destroyed by a huge pit coming down from the Parthian period. We assume that the sanctuaries would be here. We assume it would be 2. And the reason we assume that is because there were 2 sanctuaries earlier. And if you look at this is the Parthian period, about 100 AD. The tradition that's alive in Mesopotamia is phenomenal. These things last well until at least about 100 AD. And the form of the temple stays pretty much the same. Now, these are the 2 main sanctuaries. There's another little one down here, but that's not surprising. Very often there are subsidiary sanctuaries. But these are the 2 main sanctuaries. And so, this is probably still carrying on that tradition of the main sanctuary and the side chapel. Now, at about the same time, 1962, just as they were stopping at the Inanna temple, they decided that they would dig at Abu Salabik. And this was being done by Donald Hanson and Robert Biggs. This site is about 12 kilometers north of Nippur, and they dug there in 1962 and again in 1964. The most important thing that came out of it was a pile of early dynastic texts, very, very big things. Sometimes they could be 10 inches by 10 inches. And they took a lot of work to put back together. They were spectacular texts. And here you have Selma al-Radi, who was our Iraqi representative, who became a very close friend, and Bob Biggs working to clean the tablets and get them ready for publication. Now, 1964, well, what happened in 62 was the Oriental Institute decided it would stay at Nippur and that they would build an expedition house on the site. They'd been living in the village about 8 kilometers away. They decided they would build an expedition house on the site. And so they voted and said, this will be our main expedition in the Middle East at Nippur. So we would make a long-term commitment. So in 1964-65, James Knutstadt, the architect, came back as director. He built the dig house and worked on the Parthian fortress that was built around the ziggurat. This was my first time there as a student. That fortress had been excavated mostly already by Penn, as you'll see on that plan on the left. That's Penn's plan, done by Fisher. The aim was to remap it and remove the fortress and go down to the Ur III level of the ziggurat and the Enlil temple. But then the antiquities officials decided they wanted to keep the fortress as a tourist attraction, so that stopped the work there. Now, because of the quitting of certain people and the not hiring of people, Nippur was not worked on for 5 years, from 67 to 71. But Adams used the house as headquarters for his survey work. I was hired in 72 and resumed excavations. Mine was the 11th season. turning to the West Mound for the first time since 1900. The idea was, we've had enough of religious buildings. Let's get the governmental buildings. Let's get private houses. Maybe we find something in the way of industrial or economic buildings. And also, I wanted to determine the artifacts of the Akkadian period and the Kassite period, which was still at that point very badly known. And also to investigate the ecological history of the area. I brought out with me geomorphologists and other natural scientists, people who work on animal bones, to look at the same sorts of questions that they'd been asked for the last 10 years or so, or more than 10 years, in prehistoric digs. Now, the blue lines, those are the places that Chicago worked before I got there. Tablet Hill, the Inanna Temple, and the Acor, and the North Temple. The ones in red are the ones that I did. WA, WB, WC, WE, you don't see D and E. They were tiny little things that didn't go anywhere. F and G. And also out here, M. That's an Islamic site that we dug. In 1972, on the West Mound, I went into the big hole that Penn had left, saying, okay, they've taken away the Parthian, we can get down into the earlier periods that we're interested in. Notice the huge dunes. The dunes are still on the site. The dunes still cover much of the site at this point. They're beginning to dwindle a little bit, but they're there. And we removed some dunes, we went down, and of course, instead of finding an administrative building, we found yet another temple. In fact, it's another stack of temples. Every place you dig it, Nippur, you're going to find a temple. This one, we proved quite a lot later, is to Gula, the goddess of medicine. This is the Kassite version you're looking at. And this was the 1990, the last season we were digging. Notice, by the way, we have to still fight the dune. You see it being cut back. Now, this is the kind of thing we were finding in that building. Here's a man holding his throat. There's another one with a guy with his hand on his head and his hand on his stomach. They're indicating why they're sick. And these things are being probably bought outside, and they're being brought into the temple, and they're being given to the temple. We also found dogs, both in clay and in metal, in this building. And Gula's symbol is a dog, so it fits. And we also finally found an inscription that said Gula. Okay, now we also worked at Area WB, in a place that looked undisturbed by Penn. I walked over there with Carl Haynes, who was out with me the first season, and we said, well, this looks like it hasn't been touched. We went down into it immediately. We're in a badly cut up palace of the Kassite period. Almost nothing. We can reconstruct the walls, but only the black stuff is what's intact. The rest has been carved away. But we found enough little bits and pieces of tablets we could tell these match with other tablets which have been found by Penn, and they are the Kassite Governor's Archive. We think, but they're administrative archive. Now, cutting down into this building, oh, did I skip one? Let's skip back. Right there, cutting down into the building, we found a grave. And the grave is completely filled in around the outside with tablets. They're using the tablets as just fill. This turns out to be a governor's archive from about 750 BC. It's extremely valuable for writing the history of the early part of the first millennium. And this was published by Steve Cole, who was a student here. Now is at Northwestern. Underneath the Kassite Palace is an old Babylonian house and bakery. And we found tablets in which the guys are actually making bread for various institutions. This is occupied in the reigns of Hammurabi and his son Samsu-iluna at around 1700. In the courtyard of this house, we found 57 objects left on the floor, and even including tablets. It looks as if they just decided, let's leave this, let's go on a picnic. They walked away, leaving the stuff on the floor. And there's clear it was abandoned. And this is the first hint we had that there was something going on at around 1700. There was an abandonment going on. And right above it is the Kassite building. So you've got nothing in between that you can say that fills in the time between 1700 or 1600 and 1300 or 1400. In 3 other areas, we found the same situation. Kassite sitting directly on or a few centimeters above old Babylonian remains with no tablets later than Samsu-iluna year 30. And if you look at the pottery coming out of there, in the Old Babylonian, you look at this goblet shape. The Old Babylonian, it's sort of fat toward the bottom. And then you jump and you have a very skinny bottom on the rest of these. And we can date those to Kassite and those to OB. Why the big change? That takes you again to this chart. What is happening is we've got a gap of at least 150, 200 years maybe more, at the site. They abandon the site, they walk away from it, they come back later, they reoccupy it. And so that's why you get that line. And before we did this work, nobody was thinking this was happening. Jim Armstrong, one of the brilliant students we had here, did for a PhD this problem between the OB and the calcite and later. And he noticed, though we all noticed, this is a published thing which was published way back in the 50s. You notice that there is a dump debris in one end of this, and the other end, there's sort of a funny break, and almost no buildings go below and go above. What you're looking at is that break in stratigraphy. What you're looking at is that gap that they didn't see. They didn't understand what they were looking at when they dug this back at Tablet Hill in the 40s and early 50s, but Jim Armstrong was able to put it all together. Armstrong also did a pit at the end of that hole that was done by Chicago earlier, and was able to demonstrate that there's an old Babylonian wall at the bottom, followed by a dune, followed by a calcite wall, followed by another dune, followed by a 7th or 8th century wall on the top. So you're looking at not one but two gaps in the stratigraphy at the place. Herman Gosch, who was a brilliant archaeologist working for the Belgians, put together all of the information. He went and looked at all the dated tablets in the south of Iraq and found out that the last dated tablets in the far south, down here around Ur and Eridu, down in here, that you've got certain sites where the last dated tablet is in the late reign of Hammurabi or the very early reign of Samsu-iluna, his son. And as you go further up the countryside, it gets little later, until you get to Nippur. And when you get to Nippur, you're in the 30th year. And you go above that, and by the time you get to the later parts, the kings of the later dynasty, the only thing left of agricultural Babylonia is that yellow area. The rest of this has gone desert between the OB and the calcite. Okay? Now, part of what Gosch was doing was based upon the work we'd been doing on environmental changes and environmental record. They were doing much the same kind of work up in their area. They were working up in the north, up in that yellow area. And we were able to put a lot of this together. And with a lot of help from people like Tony Wilkinson, we began to make a really good environmental picture. Now, the things that we've done in Iraq in general, we've had a tradition of combining archaeology, texts, and the available science. And the science has become very, very complicated and very sophisticated at this point. We've been able to build long artifactual sequences from 3200 BC until 1400 AD at Nippur, and combining it with what was done earlier at other sites. We've done architectural and art historical changes through time. We've been able to get lots of literary and historical texts and to relate those to the archaeological work. Survey, landscape study, and ecological reconstruction have been extraordinarily important, especially in the last 20 years. And very important is training of generations of archaeologists and epigraphers, meaning the people who read the texts in this building, and the training that they do of their students wherever they go. Now, we're almost out of time. I could stop there, but I'll go on a little bit. We also did a little other work. In 1977, we dug at this site called Hafriyat, a pottery-making site to the east of Nippur, about 30 kilometers away. The reason we worked there is Bob Adams, who was doing survey, we had just arrived and started to do the dig one year, 1973. Bob Adams came in from the survey and said, "My God, I've just seen the biggest damned Akkadian site I ever saw in my life. It's huge. And it's being dug on there. The people are robbing it." So he left, and the next week we went out to the site with the driver who had been with Bob. And we went to the site, and it was clear it was being dug, and it was a lot of Akkadian material. And it did look like it was a very large site. But we went there, in 1977, we finally got permission to go work there. I tried year after year, but we couldn't get permission. Then we went out, we bought tents, we put the tents up, and we lived out there. The students hated it. I loved it. I thought it was wonderful. And what we found was it's not a huge site. It's a relatively small site, which moves. So that in the Akkadian period, it's a little town right there. And these are pottery kilns. This is where they're making pottery. These are the pottery kilns that belong to this site. There are over 400 pottery kilns all told on this site. They move from here over to here in the next period. They stay here for a couple of hundred years. Then they stay there for a bit, and they move to here and here. And finally, there's a little site here and a little site here of the cast site and Seleucid period. So it's a site that moves, but every single time that they move, they're still making pottery. So it's an industrial site. Now, in 1978-79, we worked up in the north near Baghdad, not very far from the Diyala sites, in a place in the Hamreen Valley, in a place called Uchtepe, where we worked with the Danes. There you see our dig house. We rented a house from the local people in the village. There are 3 Danes on the left and 2 Americans on the right. That's Richard Zettler, who now works at Penn. And what we found at that site the main site was a round fortress building, pretty phenomenal. And the reconstruction you have on the left is by Peggy Sanders, who was our artist. Okay, that's it. We have done a lot of work in Iraq. We've had we've had to work in between revolutions and coups and wars and various things. There were certain years in which we didn't know whether we would be able to work or not. What we found, though, was that the Iraqis, there were people who were willing to work for us to get us into work. And chief among those was Fuad Safar. Fuad always spoke up for us and spoke up for all the other foreign expeditions, saying, no, they're not necessarily just spies. No, they're coming in to do work. No, you should really let them in. And, we took very seriously the situation we were in. And sometimes it was a little bit tricky. You didn't know quite what your reception would be at the airport when you came in, whether they'd be nice to you or not, whether they would give you a lot of trouble going through your baggage. You didn't know whether you would be followed around when you walked around in Baghdad. You didn't know what was going to happen. But, we did it, and we were able to work there. I put in from the 11th to the 19th season. The 20th season was last year under Abbas Alizadeh. And I hope that the 21st and the 24th and the 32nd season at Nippur will happen. It's a great site. It has tremendous potential, and it is going to continue to be one of the great important sources of information on ancient Mesopotamia. Thank you very much.
Yeah. We do have time for some questions, so if anyone would like to ask them.
Yes, over here.
You showed us the Inanna Temple into 100 AD. I'm just curious, what was the liturgical language, the language in the temple? I assume on the street it was Aramaic.
They've been speaking Aramaic for about 1,000 years by that time. I mean, essentially, Aramaic became the language of Mesopotamia from about something like 1000 BC. And they're still recording in cuneiform. And the latest cuneiform texts are religious texts, which are found in places like these temples, and also in other sites like Uruk and Babylon. The tradition comes to a stop. The religion stops. There's a change in the religious structures with the coming of the Sasanians. That through the Seleucids and through the Parthians, the Seleucids follow on Alexander. From Alexander and the Seleucids through the Parthians, you still get the old Mesopotamian tradition, and they're still doing the ritual, and they're still writing in cuneiform. They may not know very much about what they're saying in cuneiform, but they're still doing it. But it stops when the Sasanians come. At something like 300, 400 AD, and then it's ended. And then people forget about it completely. Most of these sites, even these great cities, they lose their names. People don't know where they are. When people go in to look for places, places are mentioned in the Bible. They go in. You can find Nineveh. It's there. Nineveh still has its name. Nippur still has its name. It was called Nufar. Uruk was still called Warka, which is close enough to Uruk. But a lot of these great ancient sites have totally lost they're lost to memory. And so it's a matter of you dig it, you find text, and you come to the point where you can read the text, and then you know where you are. But that's more than an answer to your question. Who's next?
Thank you, Mick. As a potter, my question is, you showed mostly storage jars. I have two questions. Did you find daily use domestic ware, plates,
Of course.
cups?
Yeah, of course.
Much-
I just showed one of many plates I could have shown. Plate meaning a figure.
But eating utensils, functional ware.
No, in every period, they need about 5 or 6 basic types. They need a small dish, they need a bigger dish, you have to have something to serve in, you have to have, there are things you drink from, there are big things you store liquids in, there are big things you store solids in. No, you have the whole range. But it depends on the period. In certain periods, you will have 35 or 40 types. And in certain other periods, you'll have 6. They really pare it down. In certain periods, they're using metal, so that certain things are not as used as much. But essentially, if you look around your kitchen, you can pretty much take most of the types that in most periods in Mesopotamia they were using, because it's all functional.
Can you connect the change of the types of pottery to a change in their culinary habits, their food, the types of food, the ability to get certain food? Maybe more bowls for soups, plates for cut up beef, that kind of. Can you see a change of diet?
People are working on that, and there are people very seriously working on that, and to see how close they can get. But on almost any period, you have the same 5 or 6 basic types, and then you have elaborations beyond that. We have sometimes very peculiar things. In many periods, they like making what we think of as being ritual vessels, which are in the shapes of animals, in which you somehow put the liquid in and you pour out of the mouth. We have animals in the shape, we have fish, we have birds, we have a hedgehog, which is a very clever piece of pottery making. And but you also get sometimes.
Lamps? Did you get any lamp? Pre-Roman
Oh,
lamps?
lots of lamps. But they're using other materials for lamps too. They're using shells, certain types of shells, which they can cut and have 2 or 3 spouts that they put wicks in and put some sort of oil in the middle. Sometimes they make them out of metal, sometimes they make them out of clay, sometimes they make them out of shell. No, you definitely have various sorts of.
Thank you.
Yep.
Oh, thank you. I like the photo that you ran of the team of diggers who were working on your project and also a previous project. I've always been curious as far as archaeology is concerned. What makes a good a digger? What skills do you need to have?
Are you talking about the foreigners, or you're talking about the shot I showed of the Iraqi diggers?
I believe so. The shot that you said that you liked, and I.
Oh yeah,
liked it as
the
well.
Shagatis. But the thing is, they began. Shagat is an area which is very close to the ancient site of Ashur, which is the main site of the Assyrians. And the Germans began to dig there around 1900, 1902. And they trained those people in there to dig. And the Germans were architects. They were architectural historians mainly. They did fantastic work. They'd come out of a Greek and Roman digging tradition, so they really went after the architecture, and they did brilliant work on architecture. And they trained these people to be very meticulous. And these people would then, they would work for the Germans for 2, 3, or 4 years, and then they would go to work if a British team came in, or they would go to work for a French team, or they would go to work for an American team. Same thing was happening in Babylon. The Babylon people who were working with the Germans around the same time would end up going and working for other people. And they would train the local people. But it got to the point where they didn't want to train local people. They wanted to keep it as a guild to themselves. And the Shagatis were very nervous in the 60s when we began to train local Nippur guys. They were not happy with it. But the thing was, we were finding it harder and harder to find good Shagatis because they were getting old. They had worked for the Germans. Then, as older men, they had worked for the Americans in the Diyala. They had brought they brought over 100 guys down to the Diyala. They lived in tents. They lived in reed houses on the site. And they brought down all these kids. One of those kids, who was about 10 years old, ended up being taken into the house. He became a house servant. He became the major domo for Nippur for about 20 years. He was a phenomenal guy who kept all the accounts, went and bought everything and managed the house. So, the very clever ones would end up either working, because they could read and write, and a lot of these people couldn't, or you would look at these people. What happens is when you have people, you can tell by looking in their faces very often, this one's clever, this one's not clever. You put a pick in their hands and see what he does with it. You put a trowel in their hands and see what they do with it. You find out whether they're serious or not. And very often, you're looking at people, you can tell this one is worth hiring, this one is worth trying. And very often it works. But very often, these shirgadis, the older guys, would bring their sons and their grandsons or their nephews and say, these guys can do the work. And usually they could. They would pick people who were very good. Sometimes they would pick somebody just because it was a nephew and it wasn't very good. But there were other reasons to bring them. And you would hire them because there are other reasons to hire them. You're doing a favor for these guys that you trust. Okay?
What do you propose were the purposes of the closely adjacent canals at some of the sites?
A lot of that has to do with time. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the canal, there's a canal there in one period, and then they have to redig it, or they do a new one coming down, or they abandon that line and they do another one nearby. When we were working at this place called Hafriyat, the place with all the pottery kilns, we could see that we had canals coming down through the site. But when we went out once, years later, when we would go out and visit every once in a while, in the 80s, we went out, and one day, it had rained the day before, and we could see those aren't canals coming through. That's a river. And you're looking at different banks of the river over time. And off this river, we could see canals going off and going through that field of pottery kilns. And you could see that these pottery kilns are on that canal, and these are on that canal. And we weren't equipped to do anything about it. We didn't have any mapping, anything with us. And we had a kite with a camera on it. We ran back to Nippur. We grabbed the kite and brought it out. By the time we brought it out, there was no wind. We couldn't get it up. We came back the next day when there was wind and it was all dried out. We couldn't see a thing. Nothing showed up. This is the kind of thing that drives you nuts. That's why drones are going to make a real difference in places like this. Now, the unfortunate thing is that site, Hafriyat, which turned out to be a great site with really beautiful artifacts, and all this evidence of pottery making and brick making and all the rest, that was badly, badly, badly dug in the 90s when the Department of Antiquities, when they lost control of the countryside, and it was just riddled with holes. It looks like, it's not Swiss cheese. It looks like a kid with acne. It's just the site's gone. It's not to be saved. And they're smart enough, though, not to dig where the kilns are, because they know there's nothing out there. It just kills. So somebody who wanted to go and do a study on the kilns could still do it, but the site itself is ruined. Yeah. Next.
Yes, Doctor, if you could say a few words about the current state of the museum in Baghdad and also the Iraqi scholarship.
The Iraqi scholarship?
Yes, archaeological activities in Iraq.
The state of the museum is good, but God knows what will happen next. There are things going on right now. We have no idea what's going to happen next. They began to bring stuff out of the storerooms. They put all stuff in vaults in the storerooms. They still have the very, very valuable stuff, all the gold and the Nimrud gold and things like that. That's still in the bank, in the underground bank vaults. They brought it out and put it right back in. They showed it for one day in 2003, and they put it back. They began to redo the halls about 4 years ago, and they've done a very good job of it. They need some help with labels. The labels are in Arabic, and some of the English labels are not so good. They need some, and some of the dates are not so good, because you had a period of about 20 years in which people were not being trained well enough because a lot of the old faculty died off, retired, left the country, and the people running the departments in of archaeology and cuneiform in the universities were not as good as they had been before. And so you have a whole group of people who are trained not so well. And you had also about 20 years in which they weren't sent out to get advanced degrees. Before that, they would, it's like Fuad Safar and Tahabaka. All through the 50s and 60s and 70s, they sent people out to Germany and Britain and France and America to get advanced degrees. And they would go back with PhDs, and they became the new Fuad Safars. They became the new, and at one point, the Department of Antiquities had 13 PhDs on the staff. That's pretty phenomenal. And some of these people were okay. Some of them were very, very good, extraordinarily good. Now, there are, again, I said the training had lapsed a bit, but they've caught up. They've sent people out since 2003, they've been sending people out again for degrees, and people are now going back with PhDs. And the current Secretary of Culture, Minister of Culture, is a graduate from Stony Brook University. And there are people who've got their degrees in cuneiform from Germany and France, and they're back. And so, the people are back. It depends upon whether or not what happens politically in the country and whether it settles down. But at the moment, it's fine. And the state of the museum is good. They've done some very, and you can't believe, there's stuff there I've never seen. I was there last September for the last time. And the stuff that's on display, I've never seen. There's astonishing stuff on display that they've gotten out of various digs that they've been doing themselves for the last 35 years, or it just came out of the storeroom and just was never shown before. There's great stuff on display. And it's thousands and thousands of objects. But the statues, some of the statues I showed from the Diyala, they're in the bank vault, and the gold from Ur is in the bank vault, and the gold from Nimrud is in the bank vault, and that's liable to stay in the bank vault for a good long time. Everybody tired?
Well, please join us for reception in the Mesopotamian Gallery in the museum, but let's show our appreciation one more time for our speakers.